Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Hidden Wisdom. I am super excited to be with you today. I am pulling an audible a little bit on this week's episode. We had recorded a conversation with McKenna Woolley all about sacred sexuality that was scheduled to come out this week. But I have since felt impressed to push that back a week and have today's conversation instead. I'm excited to share that episode with you. I'm also excited to be sharing what we are sharing today. So today's episode was actually recorded over a year and a half ago with my friend Michelle Stone. We did a 2-part series, and I released the first part, and it was widely controversial, very wonderful, and how colorful people were in their response to that episode. Even though we didn't even talk polygamy at the time, we really were just talking about our own innate worth as women, our spiritual authority, our ability to go to God and to get answers for ourselves. It's a really great conversation, and I recommend going back and listening to it. But because of the response that was given to that episode, I felt like, okay, we're going to hold on part 2 because people clearly were not, it seemed, ready for a lot of this content. But with this week's discussion centering around Doctrine and Covenants 132, and seeing polygamy come into the conversation more, I felt impressed that now's the time, now's the moment. So Michelle Stone, many of you may know, many of you may not know. She is, I think, and has been one of the leading voices on discussing polygamy, whether or not that is a doctrine from God, and specifically whether or not Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Unfortunately, earlier this year, Michelle was, she took down her content from YouTube and from her website, which I think is a wild shame and very sad for her to be censored in this way, because her content was absolutely amazing. And so unfortunately, that is not available as it once was. It was a really wonderful resource for exploring these questions. So unfortunately, that is not available, and Michelle has not been outspoken since then. So again, I'm just sharing that to give context that this conversation was recorded a year and a half ago with Michelle. This is not necessarily new in terms of a new creation. It's just now being shared publicly for the first time. So with that being said, I have not ever actually publicly stated my own views and my own story on this topic. What I did with Michelle, again, was just kind of putting her voice out there. Again, we talked mostly about women and the power of women and our importance, and being willing to wrestle with questions, being willing to do the work of discernment. And then I did have a second conversation about polygamy with Cheryl Bruno, which was also amazing. She has the opposite view on polygamy in terms of whether Joseph practiced it. She believes that he did. Michelle believes that he didn't. And so that was a really awesome episode too. But as many things are on the Hidden Wisdom channel, so much of what I share has just been an organic part of my journey and my own learnings. At the time, I felt like it was more important to have this conversation about how to wrestle, how to discern, being willing to look at the hard things and go to God to get answers about them. That felt like a more relevant thing than actually sharing my own views on polygamy. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time. This is all kind of preface to the video that I'm going to share, which is the actual interview with Michelle. But I do want to say that the polygamy question came into my story about 2 years ago. Up until that point in time, very traditional, just kind of belief in the Mormon narrative around polygamy that we've received. I struggled with it when I first read section 132. The only time in my growing up years that I read something or received something through the church that did not resonate with me was when I read section 132. I was very distraught, honestly, and emotional when I read that in seminary for the first time. But like many of us do, I just kind of put it on the shelf and said, I don't know, God knows better. We'll figure it out in the eternities. I don't have to worry about it right now. You know, kind of all of the things that we use to gloss over something that's painful, right? But beyond that, totally just had a very orthodox view of the whole thing until, again, about 2 years ago, that I had a mentor who encouraged me to kind of look into the issue and start to think about it more and to start to really read the scriptures for what they're saying and what they're not saying. And I had a point, I want to say it was like Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve 2 years ago, when it had just been weighing on me so heavily. And finally, I just went to God on my knees and said, God, I will do whatever it is to be one with you because I love you. I love God. Hi, buddy.
Mommy.
Hi, baby. You want to say hi?
No, I don't
Okay.
say hi.
You hang out for just a minute. I said, God, I will do whatever. If polygamy is the thing, I will do the thing because I love you and I trust you. I just need to know if polygamy is the thing. And my experience was a very comforting, warm, very clear, that's not my thing. That was my answer from God. And it was a great relief because I think if we're honest, something in us, our intuition, our body already knows that that is not a thing that is aligned to the Most High God. And so that was my experience. And I want to suggest that that should be your experience in considering this question and considering what Michelle and I talk about in this episode, is kind of doing the Book of Mormon thing, right? And saying, God, is this true? Is this you? And then trusting the answer that comes to you from the Spirit, the answer that is not fear-based, the answer that doesn't have the voice of an external authority, the answer that pierces your heart. That is the answer that is for you. So to that end, a couple of thoughts and maybe like a little bit of a framework that I would suggest just based on my own observations and my own journey. First off, so there is a big tendency in the church to want to look at Joseph and see, did Joseph practice polygamy or not? And this is something that I would greatly caution you against. We do talk a little bit about church history and the origins of polygamy in the church in this episode with Michelle. But I want to suggest to you that the question of whether Joseph Smith practiced polygamy or not, maybe the answer should be it doesn't matter. And the reason that I say that is because when that is the question that we're asking, we are setting. Yes.
I can't find Puppy.
Go find him.
I can't find him.
He went that way. He went that way. Go get him. He went outside. When we are asking the question of whether or not Joseph practiced polygamy, really what we are trying to do is set Joseph up as an idol and say, if he did practice polygamy, then it's okay. If he didn't practice polygamy, it's not okay. I would suggest that the question that we really need to be asking is polygamy of the Most High God? Is it of the God of love? Is it of our Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother? So that's just one thought. Another thought, in this episode, we talk quite a bit about scripture and actually reading scripture in context and understanding what it's saying. One thing that I want to suggest just as a general rule when we're reading scripture of any kind, whether it be the Bible, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, is that it's really important that scripture, more than it is a reflection of the truth of God, is a reflection of what humanity does with God. And so what I mean by that is it's very easy to read for, say, the Bible and say, this is God. Like everything in here is God, right? Which if you read it with any critical thinking at all, gets very confusing very quickly. God is a schizophrenic, honestly, if we're reading it through that lens. When in reality, I think it's more helpful to say, these are examples of what humanity has done and then projected onto God. And whether or not that is actually a true reflection of God is something that we have to exercise discernment for as well. So most scripture outside of Doctrine and Covenants 132 really condemns the practice of polygamy. That's something that we talk about a lot in this episode. And so we need to look at that, and we need to look at 132 and say, is this a reflection of the Most High God, or is this what humanity does and we project it onto God? That's a useful practice no matter what we are studying in scripture. Instead of taking it at face value, this is really applicable to our study of the Old Testament next year. There are different gods in the Old Testament. There is the God of love and there is the God not of love. And so it takes a lot of effort on our part, and we have to trust our own divine connection to God to determine what is actually truly God and what is not. One thing I want to suggest as well. Okay. Another point, something that tends to come up in these conversations that can be really kind of challenging to wrestle with is related to the idea of sealing and temple sealings and the idea of temple marriage, and particularly the idea that in our church, a man can be sealed in the temple to more than one woman. This is a really challenging thing to talk about because eternal families are like the pinnacle doctrine, right, of what we have to offer. And I absolutely believe in eternal families. In fact, I believe that that is applied universally. I think all our families are eternal. I talk about that not in so many words, but a little bit in my book, Consider Yourself as Eve, when I am discussing temple symbols and the interpretation and understanding that the first ordinance, we can think of it as the symbols in a temple, but the actuality of that ordinance is the ordinance of birth. And so when we see it that way, we understand that to be born is to be born in the covenant because you have received the first ordinance of birth. So that's a big difference. That's something to keep in mind, is that everything that we're doing in the temple is a symbol. Sealing is a symbol, right? This is a beautiful symbol. It's the pinnacle. It's something that was taught anciently in the ancient mystery schools and temples, is this unification of masculine and feminine, of man and woman. And so on one level, sealing is a symbol of our inner union, of our own unity, of our own masculine and feminine spirit, of these energies, that these things are brought into balance, into wholeness with each other. And then we can produce that relationship with our spouse as well. But what I want to suggest is that in the temple, we are receiving the sealing from which we can gain the teaching. It's still our responsibility to go home and live that and to cultivate that relationship in ourselves with God as wife and as husband individually, before we are going to come together in full unity. And when that sealing takes place, that sealing is done by Christ directly. So with that being said, I want to suggest that we know, I think, in the church to some degree that our sealing is contingent, right? We say it's based on your faithfulness. The way that we think about that is my sealing is immediate, so long as, and we're going to stay sealed as long as one of us doesn't screw it up. And I want to say that we have that a little bit backwards, that our sealing is actually aspirational. It's something that we are both still working towards as we are developing spiritually. And the actuality of that symbol is still futuristic for, I would say, pretty much all of us. So I share that to be hopeful. And I share that to also suggest that even if a man has participated in the symbol with more than one wife, that is not necessarily the actuality of that event. And the actuality is something that we all have to look forward to, that's even more beautiful and glorious and amazing. And of course, it starts in ourselves. All of these points really come down to an understanding of the divine feminine and her application, and the just blatant reality that I have learned as I have studied for the last several years and as I've practiced and embodied these things. And that is that polygamy and the divine feminine are mutually exclusive. You can pick one. The reality is that the divine feminine in her fullness, our Heavenly Mother, right, is the supreme archetype of the divine feminine. She is the equal and opposite to Father. And it's the two of them coming together in unity, in themselves, balanced and whole. 1 + 1 = 1, or 1 + 1 = 11, right? Like they are this expansive, creative force together. The divine feminine is about our intuition. It's about our own understanding of our personal divinity and therefore our own spiritual authority to tune in and to have and cultivate a direct relationship with God, where I do get direct answers. I have a relationship with my heavenly parents that far exceeds anything that I am receiving from external sources, this divine connection. And so I think that if we were honest and really learning how to cultivate that aspect of us, which men and women all have a feminine aspect, it's the part of us that is based on relationship. It comes together in community and connection. It is intuitive. It's internal, this journey that we embark on when we are tapping into the divine feminine. It lives in our body. It's very somatic for women, right? Like we're very deeply connected to our bodies as the instrument of our creation, our ascension, our revelation, all of these things. If we can learn and tap into that honestly, I think that most people would come to the conclusion that it is revelatory that polygamy makes me feel sick. It is revelatory that polygamy in my body feels so horrible, right? And being willing to hold that up and see that as credible as the more masculine forms of revelation that we are tending to look to more often. This is the path of partnership, is when we have a whole woman and a whole man in unity with each other. Anything that disrupts that pattern is questionable. And I want to say that I share all of this with a sense of the gravitas of this and with deep compassion, because I know polygamists. I am friends with polygamists. I have served with them and I have seen their lives and I have admired them and felt so much the love that God has for them. And so I don't mean for this to come across as condemning at all. But at the same time, I also see the reality where I spoke at a polygamous women's conference a couple of years ago in the summer, invited by a friend of the podcast who I love. And it was several women and a couple of men sitting amongst their wives. And I had one sweet woman come up to me. She was one of two wives, I want to say, older woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, older. And I was so amazed that these women, like, they just deeply are resonating with the reality of the divine feminine. And she came up to me and she's like, this is so powerful. This is so true. Why don't our men know that we are their equal? And it hit me like a punch to the gut. Because the answer is that they can't. In a system of polygamy that does nothing to invite men to see a woman as equal, to see one woman as an equal partner, that doesn't encourage either party to put off the natural man and to do the deep work of healing themselves so that they're not looking for external sources of validation, even from their spouse or spouses, but that they know that they are worthy because they are a piece of God. The system does not encourage that behavior. So that is what I have to say about that. I understand this is a very heavy topic. If you are triggered, I'm sorry, and please go to God and say, God, why is this triggering me? What do I need to heal through Christ that the situation is bringing up for me? If polygamy feels sick in your body, listen to your body. See that as a valid source of revelation. Our bodies are a gift. They are deeply connected to our spirits. So tune into that and take it seriously. As I said, Michelle's content is not available right now, unfortunately, but there are other resources that I highly encourage. I would encourage everyone to check out Gwendolyn Wine on YouTube. She's a friend of mine. We've had her on the podcast. She has done fantastic work. Her voice is just so gentle and accessible and loving. She's really wonderful. If you're interested more in like the church history side of it, you could also check out Still Mormon as another YouTube channel. These people are doing fantastic work. I want to remind everyone that if our testimony is in anything but the reality of the Most High God through Christ, then we are built on a standing foundation. If our testimony is in the church or in the reliability of leaders of the church, we are built on a standing foundation. If our testimony is in Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or any other prophet or leader of the church, we are built on a standing foundation. And this can make us angry when our foundation gets shaken. Nephi talks about this in 2 Nephi 28. He says, they're angry because of the truth. They tremble lest they should fall. So if anything here is triggering you to feel angry, I would suggest that maybe that's an opportunity to evaluate where is my foundation, and how do I make my foundation the truth of the Most High God because of my divine connection to God through Christ. All right. I love you all. We'll slip over and get into
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I am back with Michelle Stone. We got off of our last episode and we couldn't stop talking. And so we decided to do a part two because where I feel like we talked about a lot of high-level principles, just these issues to find truth. We didn't really get to talk about a lot of your research and some of the things that you've actually found. So in this episode, we're going to do some myth busting. We're going to talk about some of the key arguments that people use first off to justify polygamy in general and to say that it's a godly practice. We're going to dive into the scriptures and hopefully you guys will get some ideas about how to read and interpret the scriptures from that. And then we're also going to talk about how we tend to justify that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And we're going to myth bust some of the key resources that we turn to suggest that that was reality. And I hope that those who are listening to this can keep an open mind and be willing to really let the Spirit teach you and speak to your heart about if there's something that you need to dig into more, if there's a practice you need to incorporate into your study, if there's a triangle that needs to be shattered that you might have adopted. All of those, I think, are on the table and likely to be challenged in this episode. So, Michelle, thank you for coming back for round two.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It'll be fun to move the conversation this direction as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you've done so much work, so I'm excited to share your ministry and some of the key things you found. So first off, talking about polygamy in a little bit more of a general sense, just the idea that this is of God, right? That's what we suggest. That's what's been suggested by the narrative of our church since the Restoration. So the first point that people tend to make, well, I won't say the first, one of the points that I hear most of raising up seed, which we interpret to mean having lots of children to help perpetuate the covenant. Let's talk about that to begin.
Okay, so all of these ideas are intermingled. So I'll go a couple of different places with this, but what's been fun in this research, I didn't mention this in the first one. When I first had these ideas shattered for myself about polygamy being of God, no one would talk about it. I tried to bring it up in some big Facebook groups. It was Facebook at the time. And they would be like, you can't talk about polygamy here. So I started my own Facebook group to talk about polygamy. and it was crazy because people that were pro-polygamous started joining. So a bunch of the best polygamy scholars like FLDS, I don't know if they were FLDS fundamentalists, current polygamists, joined. And so I got to come up against the very best arguments in favor of polygamy in the scriptures, if that makes sense. So that was actually really helpful to me because I knew what to address. So this idea that polygamy is like, look, polygamous cultures have more children than non-polygamous cultures. It shows up in all different kinds of ways. It stems in large part from Jacob chapter 2. So people who read the Book of Mormon are sometimes taken aback because Jacob, his sermon he gives, it's actually in chapter 2 and 3, I think it's in 1 also, is very much opposed to polygamy, right? But we take out verse 30 and I call it the loophole. It's like all of this you can ignore because of this verse and how we twist it. It's interesting. People don't know this. I guess Nauvoo actually used these scriptures to oppose polygamy. And so the loophole came about later when they were trying to find a way out of it. So is it okay if I go ahead and read Jacob 2, yes. 30? So this is the only part of this long, beautiful discourse that's really included in the conversation about polygamy and in our manuals. It says, for if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. So the interpretation they want us, the polygamy pushers want us to take, is that God is saying, if I want to raise up seed, I'll command my people to do polygamy. Otherwise, they have to hearken to the things I'm saying here. Right? So we can go to, I guess, sort of the sociological discussion first, but polygamy does not result in more children than monogamy does. All polygamy does is allow more children for certain men who happen to be very, very elevated in the hierarchy, right?
Mhm.
But polygamist women tend to have far fewer children than their monogamous counterparts. So the only one is where there are very few men and a lot of women, right? So you need, you could argue, well, then those few men need to impregnate a lot of women because there aren't enough men. But in anything, like we know, throughout all of history, biologically, the birth rate is actually skewed a little bit more toward male. It's right, like God established it so that males and females are represented equally. Boys have a little bit higher mortality rate, infant mortality rate, and then through the rest of their life. So that seems to be kind of even provided for in the birth rate. And so there's the only situation where polygamy would ever result in more children being born is in that one that I explained, if the men were all dead, which ties into another scripture, result in more children. In the Book of Mormon, where the only people, like the Book of Mormon is the most anti-polygamy book of any of our scriptures. The polygamists in the Book of Mormon are soundly condemned. It's King Noah, right? For they did not do as God commanded them. They had many wives and concubines. So King Noah, and then the same thing in Ether with Replication, in the Book of Ether with Replication. So it's always universally condemned. And yet, when they established that exceedingly quickly, right, they had a lot of children. And so there is no justification for polygamy in terms of having children. If you want to go into 230 and the way that it should be understood, in my opinion, I could do that now if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it really quick because I think this is really helpful just for anyone trying to read and understand the scriptures. So let's do that.
Okay, so we'll just hit on a couple of things really quickly. There are many different ways that people look at this, but I'll just give a couple of little insights. So it says, first of all, if you read it in context, there's our manuals will often do an ellipsis and take out the for, because it says for if I will, and replace it with like a nevertheless or a but. So it seems to be contradicting what comes before, and it doesn't. So it says the whole thing building up to it is the Lord condemning polygamy, universally condemning it, and saying the people in Jerusalem were doing these abominations, which is why I brought you out, so that I could raise up seed unto me. So since we're just talking about raising up seed, a couple of really important verses to join together. There are more, but I'll just hurry and give you these couple. First Nephi chapter 7 verse 1 is when Lehi is telling his sons to go back to get Ishmael. So this chapter, it's very clear that there is a perfect 1-to-1 ratio. Each of the sons of Lehi take one wife of the daughters of Ishmael, right? And so, but right here in verse 1, the Lord spake unto him, saying that it was not meet for him, Lehi, that he should take his family unto the wilderness alone, but that his sons should take daughters to wife, that they might raise up seed unto the Lord in the land of promise. Raise up seed, exactly what we're talking about in Jacob chapter 2 verse 30, right? If we want to go back to Jacob 2, it also talks about raise up seed in verse 25, slightly different wording, but it's the same thing. It tells us a little more about it. This is Jacob 2:25. Wherefore thus saith the Lord, I have led this people forth out of the land of Judah, a righteous branch from the fruit of the loins of Joseph, right? So the whole reason the Lord brought them out is so he could raise up seed. So, and then it goes on to tell us in verse 35 that verse 34, that Lehi was commanded that no one should practice polygamy. He calls it abominations. It's part of the abominations that he was calling out in Jerusalem that made them want to take his life. So it says in verse 34, and now behold, my brethren, ye know that these commandments were given to our father Lehi. Wherefore ye have known them before, and ye have. So he's saying, and these commandments that he's giving are that you should only have one wife and no concubines, right? And so it's so interesting to read Jacob 2:30 in context, where it says, or if so the whole thing is you can only have one wife as a lamb for your sake if you do this. For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, meaning raise up a righteous branch, that won't be polluted with these abominations, I will command my people. He commanded Lehi. He's commanding them right here, right? I will command my people. Otherwise, they shall hearken to these things. And that's the other thing I could point out throughout this chapter when it talks about these things. Every time it uses the word things, it's talking about the abominations committed by David and Solomon, or the people. And I'll give you one example quickly if I can find it. So verse 23 says, for they seek to excuse themselves in committing whoredoms because of the things which were written concerning David and Solomon, right? So these things are, you will hearken to these things, your misinterpretation of scriptures. So there's there are several arguments of why this claiming that more babies are born. I have to say one last point on this, because this is one that gets me. You have to continue on after verse 30 to the end of the chapter, because throughout that, it tells us the reason that God contemns polygamy. It continues, for behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow and heard the mourning of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem, yea, and all of the lands, and in all the lands of my people, because of the wickedness and abominations of their husbands. And I will not suffer, saith the Lord of hosts, that the cries of the fair daughters of this people, which I have led out of the land of Jerusalem because of their abominations, shall come up unto me against the men of my people, saith the Lord of hosts. And it goes on talking for 3 more verses about the suffering of the women, saying their hearts died, pierced with deep wounds. So the entire reason that God forbids polygamy is because God loves their daughters. Heavenly Father and Mother care about the experiences of women, right? And so that's the entire reason for abandoning it. So if we want to justify polygamy and saying, well, more babies were born, then God commanded it so that more babies could be born. First of all, you are ignoring every part of the record. And then you are also saying, if God wants more babies to be born, he doesn't care about his daughters anymore.
Right.
In that
Which
moment.
is so
God would
counter to
prioritize.
God.
Yeah, like God is utilitarian, that it's like, oh, you know what? If I need a baby born by that woman, you can rape her because I need a baby born and she's not willing, right? That's basically what we're saying.
Right. We're saying that the ends justify the means, which is not how God
for
works.
God.
That's not how God works.
Exactly. That was one of the things that really clued me in, is reading and comparing how God thinks about women. And those were not written by the same God.
No.
So
yeah, that's
there's
really
a long answer to that.
Well, I love this. And I think that you're highlighting a couple of things that I try to stress that I believe our audience is aware of that are really important when it comes to studying the scriptures. The first off is you have to take stuff in context. You cannot just remove verses from context and use them to prove your point. I mean, you can, and we do it all the time, but you really shouldn't. And then the other thing is learning how to define things the way that the Lord defines them and not superimposing our own definition. Like, you need to go and look at, what does raise up seed mean to the Lord, not what do I think it means. And I love how you pointed out that what it means to the Lord, it's about raising up a covenant people. It's about raising up people of a spiritual stature that they can inherit the blessings of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Like, this is not at all about just having babies, because if it were, then Adam should have had 1 million wives if that was really, because they were populating a whole planet. So just something
and you know what, that actually goes beyond. Every single time God established a people to raise up a covenant people, it was always in monogamy, because we have Adam and Eve, we have Noah and his wife and their sons and their one wife each. The animals, right? Why weren't there like 7 females to every male? Established it this way. Also, if God wanted it to be this thing, the birth rate would be different, because that's another thing that we see happening in polygamous communities, happened in early Mormonism as well. You have to get rid of the boys.
Right. Which brings us to our next argument. That brings us to the next thing that people like to say, is that polygamy is instituted in times of war for men to take care of widows if there is a scenario where there are fewer men than there are women. And we kind of talked about how that's the only way that you could make the birth rate argument make sense. So what is it about this argument that falls short of justifying polygamy as something being from God?
Perfect. Okay, so we do use this to say this is why it was done in early Utah, right? Like they had to take care of the widows. So there are a couple, we'll go to the scriptural aspect of it, and then the historical aspect of it. So which one should we do first? Remind me to come back to the historical. I'll go to the scriptural
We'll
first,
do that.
if that's
We'll
okay.
do that. Mm-hmm.
So this argument is justified for the people who use it by Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1, which is also in 2nd Nephi, hold of one man saying, give us, I should have it memorized. I have many times, but it's basically saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own apparel. Just give us thy name to take away our reproach. That's pretty close to what it says. So they're saying, look, God is saying that polygamy will need to be there in the last days, right? So first of all, again, taking it completely out of context. And anyone who takes one verse of Isaiah and claims to know the interpretation to justify their own pet doctrine, run away from them, because Isaiah is a massive, anyone, like, okay, fine. If you're going to tell me what that verse means, let me choose 5 other verses. You tell me what all of those mean too. Exactly, right? Like, for example, all of the times it condemns the prophets in the last days, right? How are you going to explain those to me? For one, so I won't go into it fully. But one beautiful interpretation that I love of that is that it's actually not painting a pretty picture of polygamy. It is a war-torn nation because the entire chapter 3, like the men are all killed, but it also condemns all of the daughters of Zion. And it's not just talking about men and women. These are deeply symbolic concepts that deserve study. But in any case, you're saying that all of the men are killed, all of the women are bald and scabby and diseased, but you get 7 of them. You know what I mean? Like, it's just this phrase polygamists use, like in the Kingston group, the women have to pay rent to their husbands for the crappy little apartments that they live in, right? So it's this idea of, no, you have to eat your own bread, your own apparel. I'm not obligated to provide for you at all, because Isaiah says so. That's how this is used, right? So one beautiful interpretation of this that I love is that in the book of Revelation, there are 7 churches, right? 7 is kind of the number for the whole world. If we even just take that one aspect, I'll just share this one little insight. The 7 churches as the 7, and the woman is also often the symbol of a church. So here we have 7 churches saying to Jesus Christ, we want your name. We don't want to be dependent on you in any way. We'll do everything on sacrament, right? We'll wear our own apparel, another covenant reference with temple clothing, or say we'll do it all our own way. We just want your name. It is telling us something important about the message that's given everywhere about how all of the churches have become fallen and an abomination. There are so many better ways to interpret that one verse. So a couple of other things also, the people of Limhi, and you'll remember that they went up 3 times to try to defeat their Lamanite captors until they finally humbled themselves to the dust and realized this was their situation. Most of the men had been killed, right? These were the mothers that raised, they instituted a practice of the men caring for all of the women, right? Caring for many other women. So we have a Book of Mormon example of that exact scenario, and they didn't implement polygamy. And a couple of other things. Jesus tells us to care for the widows and the orphans. When you say a woman has to marry a man in order to be cared for, that goes from charity for the widows into prostitution, which is what the Lord calls this in Jacob 2:30. If you're saying you have to marry me in order to not starve to death, that's prostitution straight up, right? Why in the world would they not just follow the commandment of Jesus and care for the widows and the orphans in any society where there are widows and orphans, like the example of Limhi gives us?
Like, that's a very celestial law of justice in order for me to God. That's all I wanted to add to that.
Oh, Absolutely, absolutely. To take Jesus's command to care for the widows and turn it literally into prostitution is despicable. And
Mhm.
so the last point I will make is that actually was not the situation in early Utah.
Mm.
The polygamist wives were not primarily widows. Polygamous wives were generally not provided for well. There
Mm.
was massive, massive poverty. Brigham Young's wives were provided for better because he was one of the wealthiest men in America. He was the wealthiest man between Chicago and the West Coast.
Mm.
That all came to him through the church. But the people that were married off, it was horrible. Like it was the women were actually very scarce during the Great Reformation. I have an episode on that people might be interested in. It was a terrible, terrible time. And polygamy, along with blood atonement and other things, were being like
Mm.
shoved down everyone's throat. There were no available women. So what started happening is what happens in every polygamous community like this. The marriage rate for girls goes down, down, down. The marriage age, the average marriage age for men goes up, 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 up to where it was something like 13 average, right? I have like, and it was often almost like the most vulnerable girls were those who didn't have a father. They weren't protected. So if your father died and you immigrated to America, you were given away. It happened to my great great grandmother. She was in conference at 17. Brigham announced over the pulpit, "Hey, take Mariah with you." And so this 40-year-old couple, Anson Call, who he and his wife, who knows what they thought of the situation either. But the next morning, she left her mother and had to go live this terrible, terrible life that she'd been given into until he finally divorced her, kicked her out of the family, what do you call it?
Compound. Yeah.
Compound, the family compound, thank you. And kept all of her children. She was only allowed to take her nursing baby. And she made her way back to live with her mother, who had also been widowed and given away in another marriage. And when that baby was old enough, the oldest son was sent back to take that baby too. This is what polygamy is. This is not caring for the widow, right? And one other point I'll make is that the difference in how God sees women from how polygamists see women, right? You know, the whole FLDS keep sweet. Women in polygamy are taught your feelings are evil. Any feelings you have comes from temptation. It's the devil, and your job is to ignore your feelings, bury your feelings, right? Because that is what Section 132 says, and that's the only way polygamy can work. Brigham Young talked about the incessant whining, like, and if you read the histories, it's things like women's children dying because their needs aren't being met, or because they're trying to solve actual problems, but all that is heard is whining, right? And so it really is like, can women be seen? Does God care about the experiences, the desires, the needs of women, or are they just a means to an end? Are they just like cattle to be, like, if you read 132, they're given, willy-nilly taken here and there, like their own desires are not even relevant. They're not even seen. They're not allowed to exist. So there are a couple other insights into that one about the widows. Next.
That's so good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Lots of food for thought there.
Let me give you one more defense for polygamy, if I can. Abraham, right?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Abraham
and
did it.
Jacob.
Well, yes, except the Doctrine and Covenants 132 multiple times says Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is another interesting thing to know. I have yet to find.
Yeah.
Isaac wasn't a polygamist,
Yeah.
but 132 thinks Isaac was a polygamist. One good thing to know, Joseph Smith was an excellent scriptorian. He tended to know his scriptures, right? Some of these other men who got this up later in Utah weren't necessarily. So
we'll talk about that. We'll come back to that.
Okay. So a couple of things. Yeah, just really quickly. 132 claims that God commanded Abraham. That is not the case at all. Again, if anyone's interested in any of these topics, I've done multiple episodes on each of these topics, but Sarah told Abraham because they wanted another child, right? It had horrible fruits. Yeah, they wanted children. She hadn't yet had Isaac, right? It led to horrible, horrible things that are still troubling the world today, right? The fruits of it are terrible. God never commanded Abraham. The story of Abraham should be viewed as a cautionary tale.
Yes.
As should the story of Jacob. Neither Abraham nor Jacob was commanded by God. Abraham always submitted to the desire of Sarah, who was the one who suggested it to him.
Mhm.
It was her slave, by the way. So really, Hagar was used as a surrogate because they wanted, it wasn't really seen as another wife. She was a surrogate to have children for them. So, I've used the term sex slavery, not that I think Abraham was wicked, but this was their culture. We want to claim this as our culture, right? And then if you have Jacob, he was tricked by a despicable father-in-law, right? God never had, and then also that should be viewed as a cautionary tale. If you look at the situation of Jacob and his family that led to attempted fratricide, right? They tried to kill their brother because they were so jealous of him. And that always exists in polygamy. So that's another argument that people use. And it's like, we have the 12 tribes. Well, right. And each one of us, including Jesus, has rape and prostitution and all kinds of things in our genealogy coming down to us, right? The ability of God to create good things out of terrible things gives credit to God. It shouldn't lead us to justify those terrible things as being from God.
Yeah, really, really excellent points. Thank you for that. And I think that there is, I like how you call Abraham and Jacob and their stories cautionary tales. I think that's very true. I think there's also a lot of prophecy. We were talking about Isaiah 4 and the fact that we read that so literally, but really when you step back, you're like, 7 is a highly symbolic number, women versus masculine, like the feminine versus masculine. There's like a ton of symbolism in all of that. I think that it's actually really helpful, especially to look at Jacob's story as symbolic too. Where there's this period of time that he is working and laboring to inherit something that he thought was going to be it. And then there was this switcheroo, and all of a sudden it wasn't that. And then he had to work another 7 years. And I think there's actually a lot of end time prophecy that can relate to. That's a discussion outside of the scope of this. But we can see that there is purpose, that the Lord is trying to teach us something bigger and not get fixated on these little details that are unsupported in every other place that you can find. So again, reading things in context, looking at them for the different layers of truth, and being able to take from that, I think is really important. Okay. Are there any other common justifying polygamy arguments that you tend to hear talking from a scriptural perspective before we want to move on?
There are several, but maybe we should move on.
Okay.
Here's another common one that we better address is that Nathan gave David his wives, right? That God gave David his wives. That's another one that 132 jumps on to the claim that, I'll have to find the verse really quickly if I can find it. But Nathan comes to David after he's taken Bathsheba and had, is it Uriah killed? And says to him, "Thou art the man," and then he's condemning him and saying, God hath given you your throne and your wives, and he would have given you more of all of these riches if you had wanted it, right? And so they say that I just butchered that. I'm just trying to paraphrase it, but should have looked it up beforehand. And I'm just doing this off the cuff. So anyway, that is one of the claims: is God gave David his wives, therefore polygamy is of God, because God is for polygamy, right? It again is God seeing women as property to be given, to be rewarded. That's what 132 turns women into, right? And so a couple of things with that. The tale of David really tells us is one of the huge problems of polygamy is that lust can never be satisfied. It really is like fire. And the more you feed it, the hotter it burns and the bigger it grows, right? Till it devours everything. David, throughout the story of David, God had never gives him any of his wives. You can read how he got each one of his wives. He very much took each of his wives. God never intervened and gave him his wives, right? We have Old Testament prohibitions against multiplying wives and concubines. What they were doing even went against the Old Testament, let alone David and Solomon being used as the examples that the Book of Mormon gives us to. So the Book of Mormon clearly says that them having many wives and concubines was an abomination. 132 twists that to say only in the matter of Uriah did David sin. And right, so it's a twisted version of it. So anyway, what I believe Nathan is saying is like, look how much you have. You can say, look how much God has given you, meaning look how much you have. You have, another point I want to make is that always Solomon's wives and David's wives are kind of talked about in terms of all of their wealth. It's going through
Mm.
all of their riches, and then it lists, and they have this many wives and this many concubines, especially with Solomon. So you can see that his is how they were viewed and counted, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Nathan is saying to David, look how much God has given you. And still you wanted more. Still you weren't satisfied, right? David was up the mikvah is where the Jewish women have to bathe for their ritual purification.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be rainwater. So it was up on the roof. So David was intentionally watching the women bathe in the mikveh, right? There is a amazing discipline that monogamous men learn to learn to not just, like be lusting after all of the women in the world all of the time. That's why God established it. Polygamous men never learn that. Their lust is encouraged. That was the case with David until it grew so brightly that he couldn't see anything he wanted that he couldn't have, even if it was another man's wife. He still had to possess her, right? That and that's part of the problem with twisting these scriptures, is that we have these beautiful lessons we should be learning, and not only do we ignore that, we twist it on its head to justify the abominations. So I think that Nathan is trying to give us a cautionary tale about lust, about wanting to grab, that you can never be satisfied in your
About
lust.
the natural man, too.
Yeah.
That's an important lesson too, is that there is never a spiritual height that you can soar to that you can't fall from. And
right.
when we say that David was not in the wrong, then we put him on a pedestal and we're making flesh our arm, and we're saying that he was so good he couldn't ever fall. And that's just historically not true. Lucifer was the son of the morning and he fell.
Good.
So
Yeah.
important to know. Okay, so we've kind of already started bridging into this, but now I want to talk about some of the main arguments that people use for the latter-day practice, specifically Joseph practicing polygamy, because I think that is universally the narrative that I grew up with, right? Was that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. It started with him, and it was, blah, blah, blah. Ever since then, we know what the narrative is. Interestingly enough, when I was in seminary, as a teenager, reading section 132 was the one and only time in my life that I have read the scriptures and felt a stupor of thought. And my heart sank, and I was like, what? Well, up in my life at that time, obviously. Since then, I've had more insight. But in my life until that point, I had loved the scriptures, took the scriptures at their word, and I read that section, and something inside of me, and I think most people, just screams that this is not true, that this is not of God. So can you give us a little bit of background on section 132? Where did it supposedly come from, and how did it come into the body of canon that we have today?
Sure. Okay. So again, there are names that people are maybe not familiar with. William Clayton is an essential name in understanding Joseph's polygamy, because we have the quote William Clayton Journal, which we claim is the main contemporaneous record of Joseph's polygamy. So I'm going to tell you, so according to the church narrative that comes 100% from William Clayton, there's one, well, first of all, it's important for people to know the church has never released the William Clayton journals. We have, it was Andrew Ehat, who you were talking about, who was going to write a book and was given access to the William Clayton journals. He made notes of them that were kept in an office at BYU. Some people who were holding meetings there found his notes and disseminated them. So all we have, which broke Andrew Ehat's heart. It's kind of a sad story, but all we have from from William Clayton's journal are these notes that Andrew Ehat made. They're in no way comprehensive. We've been told by various historians who have seen them to not take them as, like there's way, way, way more to the story. But anyway, that's all we ever have. The church has never let us actually see the journal. They announced in 2017, I should say the journal, the compilations of journals. There is so much funny business with these journals that they are highly, highly questionable to people willing to question them, that don't just want to go along with the narrative. So anyway, so the William Clayton journals are the source we have that says that on July 12, 1843, this is the story people will have heard, Hiram was talking to Joseph saying, I know I can convince him if you just write the Revelation. So Joseph said, I know I'm better than you do. He told William Clayton to get the paper and to write it down. It says in that, well, so we have that little journal entry, but what most of the story comes from far later affidavits, which is pretty much the case with all of Joseph's polygamy, from William Clayton wrote a letter in 1871 and then wrote an affidavit in 1874 filling out this story, which contradicts in some interesting ways with the short journal entry. But basically, Joseph quoted the revelation. William Clayton wrote it down. Hiram took it to Emma. Emma yelled at Hiram. They brought it back, and within a few days, Emma destroyed it. Some versions say burned it, and then, but in that meantime, Kingsbury, it's Bishop Whitney that had a store, and his clerk Kingsbury, he had him make a coffee that he kept really secret that nobody knew about. But all of a sudden in Utah in 1852, so this is 8 years after Joseph's death, there's a special conference held in August 1852 where Brigham announces he has the revelation. He says, none of you knew this existed. And for those who did know of its existence, you supposed it had been destroyed. But surprise, surprise, I've had this hiding in my desk the whole time. And now I'm going to read it to you. So a lot of people don't know that what we have now is section 132 first made its appearance in 1852 with Brigham's claim that he'd had it locked in his desk, which is problematic in so many ways. It was in Nauvoo. All of a sudden they're in Utah. When did he even get his desk? What is the story with this revelation, right? And so anyway, that's one part of it that people need to know. There's a lot more to this. Like I've looked into this case a lot more, but that's the nuts and bolts of it. William Clayton claimed it was July 1843. Brigham Young pulled it out of his desk. It does not have, like in so many ways, it's not Joseph Smith's writing, but it is the main thing linking Joseph Smith to polygamy. Big discussion to go into of why it is so suspect.
Yeah.
But it's not a good claim.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And we've already kind of hit on that if you even just go to section 132 and read it with an inquisitive eye, you'll start to see that there are so many inconsistencies between it and just the body of scripture that we have, let alone if you start to read more of the histories that are contemporaneous and that are available to us. Let's talk about that.
Can I add one piece to that?
Mm-hmm.
It's internally inconsistent in many ways. So we actually do know, I didn't know this until I learned, well, everything you don't know until you learned it, but I didn't know this at first, that Joseph Smith actually did receive revelation on eternal marriage. And so you can see parts of what I believe are the true revelation, because I could tell you the verses. It's in the teens and into the early 20s where it talks about a man and a wife becoming sealed, going through that pattern together, right? And it's described purely monogamously. The entire process is a man and a wife going through this process of becoming sealed, of becoming celestialized, I guess, or sanctified, whatever term, exalted, right? So the question is, okay, and it also makes clear that singly people are angels, like they're ministering angels if they are alone and single. So the question is, so if a man and woman go through this process together to become exalted as a couple, as is necessary, then what happens? Does the man leave the woman alone and go do that with another woman? Right? It can't happen. And there's no allowance given for them to do it other than one man and one woman together. You can't do it with one man and several women. It doesn't work. So even 132, the parts of it that could be true, pose polygamy, just as the rest of all of Joseph Smith's scriptures and revelations do consistently. In Doctrine and Covenants 42, it says that a man should have one wife and cleave to her and none else, right? It's like there's a huge library of Joseph and Hiram and Emma preaching vehemently against polygamy in no uncertain terms that we want to ignore. It was erased from the early church history, much of it, or it's been altered and changed.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I've learned through your channel was also about section 101. And that section 101 in the original Book of Commandments is not the section 101 we have now. It was actually a revelation verifiably given by Joseph Smith about the nature of marriage. And it expressly says that polygamy is not of God and is an abomination, and that marriage is between a man and a woman. That was in the book until the 1876 version, if I'm correct, where they took that section out, renumbered the revelations, and added section 132. Something really important to think about.
Yeah.
So
one thing I should clarify, it's not necessarily a revelation, but it is it's a statement on marriage. It's kind of like the 13 articles of faith. Like it's saying, this is what our church believes about marriage.
Mhm.
And yes, it became canonized. It was unanimously supported by every organization in the church.
Yes.
And Joseph supported it being added to the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which it was prepared for. And he was the one in charge of preparing the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants. It was all prepared before his death,
Yeah.
even though it was published just after his death. It was included there. And yes, all during Mormon polygamy, it was still in the scriptures as
Mhm.
canonized scripture. And it wasn't until 1876, right before Brigham's death, that 101 was removed and 132 was added.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Super
Well, and
important
this is
for
really
people to know.
interesting too, is that it was a committee of people that were assimilating this book of commandments, that were putting the revelations in place that were going to be included in this canonized book. And that Joseph Smith wasn't the sole person that said, these are all the things that can be provided in there, because that's one of the arguments that people use to remove Section 101 is that it was claimed that Joseph didn't want that to be in the original book of commandments. But somehow, even though he's the head of the committee, he got overruled. There's absolutely nothing verifiable about that. So anyway, that's
No,
really
and
interesting.
it's impossible to claim that they would have done that without that over his objections in any way.
Mhm.
Joseph was not afraid to tell people how God wanted it or how he
Right.
wanted it,
No,
right? Like
Joseph was
he
the
worked with a
man
committee, but
for this job.
yeah, it
So,
would
yeah,
not have happened without his consent. Yes, his
absolutely.
approval and support.
Absolutely. So I encourage everyone to go look that up. Again, it was Section 101, or they refer to it as Section C1, the Roman numerals that were used at the time. I've read it and it is so explicit. It's incredible. Okay, so I want to talk about as we continue this myth busting, I want to talk about some of the personas that we're talking about here and who they were a little bit and some of their history. I know that's really hard to do because there were a lot, but there's kind of this division of personalities that you see between the Brigham Young and the William Clayton types and Joseph and Hiram and Emma. And I want to bring this up because what I think we don't realize when we take the stance of the church and the narrative that the church has given on polygamy is that what we're really saying is that Joseph and Hiram and Emma were liars, that they were adulterers, that they were hypocrites, and that they were the worst kind of people who would preach a strong doctrine in public and behind closed doors practice the exact opposite. And I know that people struggle with that because on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're saying, well, then William Clayton and Brigham Young were not truthful, right? And so it's kind of this dichotomy that it is really, really sticky to get in the mud here, but it's also really important if you start to look at this issue with a critical eye, you will realize that someone was lying. That it is undoubtable when you look at these resources, somebody was lying, and who do you believe that it was? And so I want to talk a little bit about those groups of people and kind of flesh that out a little bit as one of the things that people bring up for Joseph's polygamy, because again, we're relying on William Clayton, we're relying on Brigham Young, who said that 132 was a verifiably given section of Revelation, even though there was no one else there to verify that. So can you tell me a little bit about, and then on the other side, what did Joseph and Hiram and Emma say that we would have to completely disbelieve them?
Okay, this is a huge question. So let me start here. The vast majority of things that you have been told that Joseph Smith said in your manuals and in your, I'm talking to all of us as members of the church, and I don't know if it's the majority, but a big chunk of it comes from Brigham Young. Brigham Young had a free pulpit to say whatever he would say and never be called on it and never be questioned. And as you read through it, often like he'll speak after someone else will give a talk and then he'll stand up after and say he doesn't remember like I do. Let me correct him. Let me tell you what really happened. And they all knew he was an absolute authoritarian. He had complete power over the things in Utah, right? And he set the narrative. So I think we need to be careful to try to go back to a good historical practice is to look for contemporary sources as much as possible. And other than William Clayton's journal, and there are a couple of categories where we get the evidence. We have William Clayton's fraudulent journal that's never been released, right? I have some episodes on that too, showing that it actually is a later construction that's not an actual. We use the word journal or diary to talk about the women's journals, or these are all later creations. So during Joseph's life, we have the people who wanted to kill him. The Doctrine and Covenants calls it the testimony of traitors. We have John Bennett, Joseph Jackson, the Laws, William Law, the expositor people. So we have that category of people who claimed that Joseph was a polygamist, which we could go into why that wasn't a bizarre claim to make, because there were lots of sects where weird marriage practice happened, like the Cochranites. Jacob Cochrane had become infamous and served prison time. So you could accuse a religious sect of doing the same things that Cochranites were doing, for example, or other groups, right? So we have that group of people. John Bennett was the main villain there. Then we have later testimonies, right, in Utah, decades later, when they were totally entrenched in this system. So I thought I had one more category, but it's slipping my mind. So, but then in complete contrast to that, we have Joseph's own words and actions. And like I said, it is a library of printing things in the newspapers, excommunicating people and making it public, saying, if you do this, this is what will happen, saying we decry this in every possible way. Emma Smith's The Voice of Innocence, that Joseph had William Phelps write and Emma edited, that was presented to the entire population of Nauvoo. To a guy named Orsmus Bostwick started accusing Hiram of, they say it's polygamy, but basically of like sleeping with all of the women in the city, and that prostitution was rampant. And, the claims are all bizarre, but we lump them all together and validate them, saying, well, it was because he was a polygamist. But they gathered the entire town of Nauvoo to read The Voice of Innocence. And then Emma held 4 separate meetings for the Relief Society, so all of the women of Nauvoo could be there to hear it read. It absolutely, in the strongest language possible, decries any form of plural marriage or spiritual wifery or adultery, right? Joseph and Hiram, and then Hiram gave a huge, powerful speech on April 8th of 1840. I want to say 1844. I might have the date wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's April 8th, 1844. That Brigham tried to change it around and then completely took out of the church history. The October 5th, 1843 journal entry is an essential thing for people to understand. And Joseph in his journal says, walked up and down the streets with my scribe, preaching against polygamy, saying we would prosecute anyone who teaches or practices spiritual wifery. No man shall have but, what does it say? On this law, no man shall have but one wife. I forbid it. That's what the original journal says. Then you can see that draft, like I talked about in our last episode, where it's changed till the end. It's completely different, where it has Joseph basically doing the same thing they say in Jacob 2:30, where it's forbidden unless I command it, for I am the one that has the keys of the power. For there's only one on earth at a time. That is the only statement that we ever have of Joseph supporting polygamy, and it's completely fraudulent, right? It was done in Utah. We have Brigham Young in his own history talking about revising the history, sitting and revising the history and the new order of things. So we have this record, this consistent 100% record that's contemporaneous to Joseph Smith, where he and Emma and Hiram consistently always fight polygamy with every vehicle that they have, right? Then we can see where it was fraudulently changed. We actually can see that middle part, that draft copy. And then we can see what was passed on in Utah. And it's the people who did that we take their word for it. Everything they said Joseph did is what we believe. Brigham over the pulpit in general conference said Emma was the most wicked woman in the world and a fiend of hell, and that he knew for a fact that I can't remember all the details. He said he knew for a fact that at least twice she had tried to poison Joseph and had tried to kill him. He said that she talked Joseph into taking his garments off when he went to Carthage so that he would be killed. Like these, and we don't even know if Joseph, these bizarre claims that Brigham said. We ignore the ones that are way too outlandish. And yet we include so many of the others to justify this narrative of Joseph's polygamy. So that's always my request, is like, look, I can't tell anyone what to believe. I can tell you what's happened to me as I've gotten in and studied the actual history. What I will tell people is, look at the sources that you are believing and relying on. Look at how credible they are. Someone did something terribly wrong. For the LDS narrative, it was God, because God said, Joseph, do this. So we have Joseph sexually manipulating 14-year-olds. We have Joseph marrying other men's wives. We have Joseph exerting all of this power and making promises saying, if you marry me, then your entire family will be saved. Like to young teenage girls. We have him doing all of these horrible things. But God sent an angel with a sword that threatened to kill him if he didn't do it. Is how we justify it. Again, those later ridiculous claims. So either God did this, and this is who God is, and God does not care about women at all, right? Either that, or Joseph Smith was this predatory, awful figure who did these things. That's what the ex-Mormon or the anti-Mormon belief is. Even though the main guy making those claims is John Bennett, who was even in his own day known to be a profound liar. He was one of those psychopaths who can't settle anymore. He has to keep going to a new place to start a new life because his lies catch up with him eventually. He's the main source of information. And I could go through and show you why he's so off base, right? And then you have Joseph and Hiram's and Emma's consistent record always of everything that they said and did that lines up perfectly, confirmed by things like, I don't know, Joseph having no children with anyone other than Emma, right? Despite how long people have claimed that he did. And so all of the hard evidence that we want to look at, like children, there's not a single record, a letter, a bill, there's no evidence of any kind Joseph had any other wife, where we have things from Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and William Clayton from their journals and their letters in England in 1841 and of correspondence and like that make it very clear that they were believing and pushing this doctrine. We have other men in Nauvoo having children. They had to keep it secret from Joseph. As soon as Joseph's out of the way, they don't have to keep it secret anymore. So I would invite people to start looking more intently into the record instead of just believing what you've been told. Then don't look at the narrative, look at the footnotes, look at the sources, go see. Don't believe how they weave these things together. Go look at the sources that they cite, see when they were said, by who they were said. And if it paints the picture, if you think it paints the picture that they're telling you it paints.
Yes. Amen. Thank you. That was awesome. Yeah. Again, I think that it makes people really uncomfortable because basically what we're suggesting when we are saying that there are sources more verifiable than the ones that are used to support the narrative that actually show the opposite. What people hear is Brigham Young was a liar. What I don't want people to hear is us saying that therefore everything since him has been uninspired and the church isn't true and God isn't here and you need to leave, because I think so many people do hear that. And again, we talked about this a little bit in the previous episode. I'm not going to tell anyone one way or the other. What I want people to do for a minute though, before we emotionally want to make a decision like that, is just sit in the middle where maybe Brigham Young did really bad things. And maybe he wasn't the best. And maybe he wasn't inspired like Joseph was. And maybe he still did the work that God needed to be done. I just want to put that out there.
Let me give you a parallel to that if I can really quickly.
Yes, please do.
The New Testament, and I could look it up, but someone can look it up themselves. But Caiaphas was the high priest of the priesthood at the time of Jesus. And it says that he testified or he prophesied of the crucifixion of Jesus in his position as the high priest. This he spoke not of himself, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied. So he said, you know nothing at all. Sometimes it is expedient that a man must die for his nation, right? So even as he was plotting to have Christ killed, he was speaking in the power of his office. He just didn't understand it fully, right? It's totally possible that God can use different people different ways for different things and can work through. It's not saying it doesn't matter, right? It's not saying, oh, it doesn't matter if people are evil. It's just like God works with who he has, what he has, and we know this world is corrupted. God establishing something perfect and having it stay perfect forever was never part of the plan. There was more I was going to say on that, but that's at least a good parallel for people to remember that.
Yeah.
Well, the Jews at the time of Christ had the scriptures, the temple, the ordinances, the priesthood. They had everything that the people of God would have. And yet they were so choked in the false traditions that they had lost a lot of what it actually meant.
Yeah.
That sounds like a similar situation to today.
Yeah.
But God sent Jesus to that people, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was the people who were still in but who weren't Well, and I don't think I mean, let me just try to say, people who were there, but who weren't so choked into the false traditions that they believed everything the church said and that's all that they would believe, were the
Right.
ones who could recognize Christ. So I
Right.
think that's a good position for us to be today. If God tells us to stay in this church, only leave if God tells you to leave, and if God tells you to stay, then stay, but have your eyes open. And
Yeah.
that's a great place to be. God
Yeah.
can work through whatever garbage God has to work through, because that's what it's been since the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you bring up the example of the church at Christ's time. I think that is a really beautiful parallel because it wasn't just that they had rejected the law and had a lesser law that had happened, but 600 years previous to that, they had actually corrupted the lower law. And then they had inherited 600 years of corrupt lower law traditions. And so it wasn't just that they had the lesser law and why can't you see Jesus? You should have enough. It was that even what you had been corrupted. And the fact that that can happen to a people should be informative to us. We're not above that. I know we like to read the scriptures and put ourselves in the place of the hero and all the other churches are nasty and wrong, but like the Book of Mormon is written to us, to this church. And Moroni says, why have you corrupted the church of God? Like, these are important things for us to realize. It is important to pursue truth, and it is also important to let God be your anchor and not to make an emotional decision about something that you should be seeking really intense revelation about. And if you don't believe that there's a middle ground, there is a middle ground. And Michelle and I, we try to straddle that line, right? We try to sit here in the middle and say two things can be true at once. And I hope that's an invitation for those who are listening to this as well to start to practice that. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to myth bust, and then we'll wrap this episode up, is that there are lists of women who it says Joseph Smith was married to, and they were married on this day, and they were married by, whatever. All that information is there. So how do you look at those sources, and why is it that those are actually not good evidence for Joseph having actively practiced polygamy?
So I haven't yet recorded, at the time that we're recording this, I haven't yet released my episode on the affidavits, but maybe by the time this airs, there will be a full episode on this that I can talk to. So let me say a couple of things on this. This is what happened. Brigham Young brought the people out here where he was pursuing polygamy because Joseph wasn't there to keep an eye on it anymore, right? He taught the main doctrine. I mean, that became the central doctrine of the church, established this very hierarchical authoritarian system, right? And then years later, when Joseph Smith III, who was 11, almost 12 at the time of his father's death, he was asked to be in charge of the reorganized church and where they stayed and ended up, I think, in Missouri. But they came out, they sent a coalition of missionaries. The sons of Emma came to Utah, and that had to be as terrifying for her as like the sons of Mosiah going to the Lamanites. She was so afraid they would be killed, They came out to Utah and started to try to redeem the saints, is how they looked at it, by preaching against polygamy. And that's where the discussion of whether or not Joseph was a polygamist first came up. So the very first affidavits we have begin in 1869. We have Joseph F. Smith and some others started trying to gather affidavits from women claiming that they had been married to Joseph. That's the very earliest evidence we have of anyone claiming Joseph was a polygamist, 1869. So if you do the math, that's 25 years after Joseph's death when they've been steeped in this system. And if you look at the affidavits, I'm going to go through them, like I said in my episode, you can see they are not written by the women. They are not the women's words. They have almost exact wording. They have weird things like it says, I was married or sealed. They all say married or sealed. What does that mean? It's like trying to use this legalistic terms in this weird way, but there are a lot of other weird things where the scribe, the notary public, whoever it was, or Joseph F. Smith himself wrote it out and then had the women sign it. The women, right? Sometimes they're signed by the women, sometimes they're not. So we want to say it's the women's own words, as if it's their diaries and they're pouring their hearts out. It's these weird form letter affidavits that are written out by someone else. We have one, the one affidavit for Sylvia Lyon, she never even showed up to. So we have the empty form letter that doesn't have the finished dates in it and isn't sealed, or it isn't signed or sealed, right? So we don't want to know how much involvement these women had in any of these affidavits. They're certainly not their own words. Then we go on from there and we get later testimonies at the Temple Lot trial. Some people will have heard of that, the Temple Lot case. And there were certain women who testified at that. It's, again, something so interesting to dig into. You start to, well, half the time you laugh and half the time you just feel bad for the people being forced to make these claims. And they made them so badly often. The judge in that case did not believe that Joseph was a polygamist, did not believe these claims, right? That's already been actually adjudicated in a court of law. And the judge said that the women were, not just the women, but the people trying to make the case against that Joseph was a polygamist, he didn't find them credible, right? And that is where the majority of these testimonies come. Then we have a very few women later on who were asked by the powers that be, either the Relief Society president or others, they were visited and asked to write their history. So we have these later reminiscences that we call journals, where that's where we get a lot of the story about Helen Mar Kimball, for example, come from a series of things she wrote as an old woman, trying to support this system. And another thing we need to recognize is that in Utah, you had nothing to lose and everything to gain by being a wife of either Joseph or Hiram, right? It elevated your status immensely. It elevated your economic situation. Like everything about it was good. Whereas if you, and it's also useful to look at the compilation of preachings of how women are to follow their priesthood head. Who wants to follow their priesthood head? But women must do what their husband says, period. And most of these women were married to Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, right? Or anyway, we can go into every single affidavit and point to it and show why it has problems. So one of the examples I use is Elizabeth Smart, right? Elizabeth Smart claimed that she was the wife of this man. It took a long time for the officers to get her to admit who she was for a whole variety of reasons. So should we say believe women, therefore believe Elizabeth Smart and let her continue to go with her captor? If a woman is saying the words of the hierarchical system that has power over her, it's not necessarily a good thing to just believe anything that hierarchical system says that the woman says. Does that all make sense? We have a lot of evidence. We've already shown so many cases of where it's hard to tell a story decades later. And so these women in their affidavits weren't saying, I was pregnant with another man's, I was already married, or I was, they were just following the order, following what they were supposed to do. It's historians that have gone through later and said, wait, she was 7 months pregnant with her husband's child on that date. So then we come up with the ridiculous narrative that Joseph was marrying pregnant women, right? And and that's just one of so many examples I could give of how these things just do not line up at all well. It's really hard to tell a good lie. It's really hard to tell a good lie urgently under pressure decades later.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I think that this whole conversation should hopefully be illustrating how important it is for us to use our critical skills, for us to lean in with the Holy Ghost when the Lord tells you to look into something and really go do the work. I'm so grateful for you that you've been called to do this work and that you're making it so accessible for other people to see again with our own eyes. And it's hard to argue. It's hard to argue with your own eyes. But another thing that I would add too is that there are other ways of knowing than just what logically makes sense. And I think that one of the biggest things about this all of the things that we've been talking about today is that there is an intuitive sense that I think all rational, normal people, more moral people have, that there's something about this that is just not right, that is not godly, that does not resonate, that is not celestial, that does not line up with the character that we believe Joseph Smith was, right? And so you have to wrestle with that. And either you can shut down your intuition and say you must be wrong, or you can allow the Lord to be your teacher, go and do the work, and maybe you might just find that your intuition is right. And that is a very feminine way of approaching things. I think that this whole topic, again, it's undergirded by this almost conflict between masculine and feminine energy, not just in polygamy itself as a practice, but even in ways of knowing? Are we going to rely on logic and say, well, this person said, so that must be the truth? Or are you going to say, no, there's something about this that is not right. And I know it's not right. And I'm going to have the Lord teach me why it's not right. And so I think it's a beautiful invitation for all of us to become more attuned with our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our spirits and the different ways that the Lord has given us to know truth. And that those things are equally valid. And that if we are shutting down intuition in ourselves or in someone else, I think that should be a red flag for us. I think that there's a lot that we have to learn there. And especially, when we're considering these women who had to sign these names to these papers and trying to understand their life and their existence and the pressures that they were under and all of the things that they were juggling. I think that some people would say that it's dismissive of us to say that they were trauma bonded to their husbands, but that's actually kind of reality. And our intuitive sense should teach us that. So anyway, just something to keep in mind as we're approaching this topic and others. Okay. Do you have any other final thoughts? Anything that you'd like to share as we close here?
I want to respond to one thing you said about the women. I don't know that they were all trauma bonded to their husband. I think there were very many situations. I think we have only 8 women who actually wrote all of the testimony for all of the women. I just want to, sorry, I'm backing up a little bit, but like, for example, we have the Lawrence sisters, Sarah and Mariah Lawrence, who are considered to be Joseph's wives, that were 2 of the girls that were living with him in his home, that, teenage girls that we say he married. Mariah died in Nauvoo, so we never had a testimony from her. Sarah actually came to Salt Lake City to say that that she was never married to Joseph Smith. And yet we don't include her testimony. We still count her as a wife, right? Despite her own words. So it's good. So there are a million different reasons. We have a really important source saying that Phoebe Woodruff said that she would say whatever she needed to not be out in the cold, and like that she would just be left to die as an old woman if she didn't say what she was supposed to. So yes, I do think it's wonderful to not be afraid of the topic and to be willing to dive in, even if you're just sitting there listening so mad going, oh my gosh, we know this about Joseph Smith. People have a lot invested in hating Joseph Smith, or at least having a lot of resentment toward Joseph Smith. And it makes sense because it's painful to feel the betrayal of realizing that what you had always been taught wasn't necessarily so, right? And Joseph has been set up by both the church and the people who hate the church as the responsible party for that. And so I do think it's useful to recognize that, and recognize that you might have a lot of emotion invested in just being angry at Joseph Smith. So everything you read that he said was just a lie. And but that's not a good way to approach history. And it's not a good way to find out what happened. And what I try to tell people is that in either situation, whether you're in the church or you're out of the church, evaluating this question, whether it started with Joseph or Brigham, doesn't have to affect you deeply in your like, if it started with Joseph or Brigham, the church still has problems to work with, right? In either case, and you have to go to the Lord to figure it out. And if you you've had hard experiences at the church, or you're super critical of the church and you see it as this horrible thing, well, that doesn't mean Joseph was a polygamist, right? Brigham Young should have set a lot of those things in motion as well, right? So I hope that people will be willing to just look at it honestly and openly and really value the sources over the narrative. Try to find out where our information comes from, because that's the best. I love that what you went into, by study and also by faith. Taking the Holy Spirit as your guide, asking for inspiration and guidance. I can't tell you how many times something comes into my mind to go search, or or I just turn to something. But that combination of being willing to actually study and learn and invest, even if it's just listening to a podcast, right? While saying, Lord, please help me to see truth. That's a powerful combination that I think should ideally, just like the masculine and the feminine, should be brought together to bring forth the best fruit. That's a great thing to bring together in our pursuit of truth. And it really is an awesome journey.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for all that you shared. Again, thank you for your work. And I have just loved our conversations. We might have to do a round 3. We'll have to see.
Let me know. That sounds great. Thank you. I really appreciate it.